everyone, welcome back to Existentially Blonde Podcast. I'm your host, Megan. I was out of town the last couple of weeks, but I've returned, so thank you for tuning in, and we're going to go ahead and get started. So last episode, we talked a little bit about democracy, its illusions, its promises, and this kind of uncomfortable truth that most of us don't really know or understand how it works. We started to peel back the idea of being informed and asking, what does that even mean in a world where headlines are essentially these unrelenting dopamine pellets for the politically anxious, which I feel like actually more just for everybody, because everyone is seemingly anxious in this current world that we inhabit. So this week, we're going to dive deeper into that question. And I want to first start out with discussing a personal hero of mine. This was a man who never chased power, who distrusted it instinctively, and who understood that liberty without education is destined to lead to a world of chaos. This man is none other than the Samuel Adams. We're gonna also get to Alfred Shultz later. He was a 20th century social philosopher who studied how people understand their worlds, how we decide what counts as knowledge, and why that process has become so distorted today. Shultz believed democracy only works when citizens think critically, question authority, and stay humble about what they don't know. I'll connect his ideas to our modern society, how misinformation, media theatrics, and the ever elusive algorithmic manipulation have quietly turned being informed into more of a brand instead of a virtue. But before we get there, I want to talk about why Samuel Adams still matters. Why is he still relevant today? Because when the world feels like it is falling apart, when every news story, headline sounds like almost a parody for an impending apocalypse, when we start wars that we can't afford, we send money we don't have, send and spend, same difference, and print dollars we pretend are real, I find it grounding for me personally to look at people both in the past and today, still alive, people who fought and fight to build something from the rubble, from the chaos, the dumpster fire of the situation that one finds themselves in. So, why Samuel Adams? Well, he's one of the few founders who didn't sell out. He didn't own slaves. He was vehemently against it. In fact, his whole life, he didn't crave fame, and he didn't care about his image. He cared about truth, justice, and the education of everyday citizens, the same things that we've slowly traded away for both convenience and spectacle. Success and status became these obsessions, these goals people chased and pursued in the colonies, especially in the later years, post-revolution. But Samuel Adams, never played that game. He was this rare sort of riches to rags guy who couldn't have cared less about money, wealth. In fact, he despised those things, anything that was superficial, unnecessary extravagance. He focused his energy instead on living in accordance with those principles I just discussed. He didn't just believe in liberty as a slogan, he lived it as a responsibility. And that makes him not only relevant to our topic today in this whole theme, but essential, because the story of Samuel Adams isn't just a history lesson, it's really a manual for surviving the collapse of integrity. So before Samuel Adams became the British Crown's worst nightmare, he was this kind of restless kid from Boston. He was bright, very polite, but more interested in ideas than the status quo. He was born in 1722 to a pretty wealthy family, enrolled at Harvard at 14, which was normal at the time, and graduated in 1740, the age of 18. As was custom for most Harvard men at that time, he continued on to earn his master's degree, and that was 3 years later, so in 1743. For his master's thesis, while most of his classmates and just people at that time wrote or were interested in most religious topics, so for instance, were angels real, or who are the true descendants of Adam, things like that, Samuel Adams asked, is it lawful to resist the supreme magistrate if the republic cannot otherwise be preserved? His answer was yes, and that single word would end up detonating an empire. Adams was serious, reserved, allergic to nonsense. No one saw a revolutionary coming, though. After graduating, he sort of wandered about aimlessly. He tried his hand at business, hated it, lost more money than he actually made. He tried bookkeeping, despised that, tried keeping a job in general. He was actually a tax collector for several years, and he was abysmal, and that was a whole catastrophic nightmare. Just a really funny story because of, and if anyone should never have been responsible for taxes, it would have been Samuel Adams. But anyway, so he really had a lot of failures after college, financial failures, occupational. His early employer, Thomas Cushing, who he got a job through his father who knew Cushing, he once said, that Adams clearly was bright, he had potential, and was a very capable young man, but his energy was always so focused on politics. And then around the time of his graduation, there was this land bank disaster. So it was a financial solution meant to keep local farmers afloat, because there was an issue with currency. There was not enough liquid money in Massachusetts at the time. And so the people essentially came up with this loan bank idea where they would put up their land or assets for collateral and then have these sort of bank notes to use as a form of currency. Obviously, there was lots of foreseeable flaws, but the problem was that Parliament crushed it, not because of those, uncertainties or things that you could see how that would be a challenge to pay off later when, land prices might be different, so on and so forth. It was because Parliament was protecting the elites, right? They didn't like this idea that suddenly all these working class people had access to currency without having to take out loans, right, from the wealthier individuals, and then having to pay interest rates on those. So it took this power away from the wealthy class. When Parliament came in and just completely banned this loan bank situation, Samuel Adams' father and about half of Massachusetts really went bankrupt. That's when politics stopped being more of a theory that Adams would talk about, to anyone who would listen. He learned the oldest political lesson on earth. Power, when distant, gets cruel. So from then on, he lived for principle. He freed the one enslaved man who entered his household, treating him more like a family member than a housekeeper or household staff. And as I said earlier, unlike most founders, he was very much opposed to slavery, which for someone championing liberty, which most of those individuals did, that should have been the bare minimum and very obvious, but I digress. Anyway, Adams believed that education for both men and women, regardless of social or economic class, was essential for a republic to thrive. He didn't crave status. He craved clarity. He was kind, humble, inflexible in principle, but generous in temperament. So this was an odd, almost paradoxical combination that drew people to him without really trying. Any room he was in, he was someone that people naturally gravitated toward. Unlike Jefferson's sort of flowery prose or Franklin's kind of salesmanship, he was kind of like a car salesman in a way. Adams built liberty like infrastructure. It was quiet, he was methodical, and it was him running around, talking to everybody, scheming, planning, one conversation at a time. Without him, Boston wouldn't have been a revolution. It would have mostly just been like a complaint. So it makes it almost poetic or tragic, I suppose, that Samuel Adams' cousin, John Adams, the one that most people usually think about, ended up on currency and in marble halls while Sam got printed on a beer label. And likely because that was how his family earned their fortune before his father passed away. But still, let's just talk about that contrast, because the difference between John Adams and Samuel Adams really mirrors the problems that we face now. So we'll talk about this kind of principle versus posture. Samuel Adams was the stubborn architect of rebellion, while John Adams was this ambitious lawyer. He wanted to preside over the finished product. Sam risked ruin, safety, and ridicule, and John, on the other hand, he wanted order, and later, when he sold himself out and became a Federalist, he wanted control. Sam lived among the people and John argued over them. So if you think about it, like Thomas Jefferson was the poet of liberty and Ben Franklin was the salesman, Sam Adams was the heartbeat that kept the body alive. He refused to compromise, even when his friends called him extreme, or they found him odd, or he was ostracized or criticized. John climbed the ladder. He was obsessed with recognition. His presidency, also, as he was the second president, birthed the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were laws that criminalized dissent and pretty much pissed on the very freedoms that Samuel had fought so hard for. What does this tell us? History, ever superficial, rewarded the man who documented himself. John curated, Sam burned his letters. One became the face of the Republic, the other the soul that it forgot. And that's where we come in, because the same dynamic is still very much alive today. We've seen this throughout history. Integrity doesn't trend, right? It's the noise that does. The loudest person who says the most extreme things oftentimes. We celebrate the influencer, not so much the conscience. If Samuel Adams were alive now, he'd see a nation still addicted to optics, more in love with its narrative than its virtue. Which brings us to the real question. What does it mean to be informed, and how did we lose that thread between conscience and knowledge? So now we're going to get into the philosophy of being informed. So we've been here before, back in the 1800s. Remember, last episode we talked about Robert Lowe, who freaked out about giving poor people the vote because they would come and steal his fucking silverware. He thought democracy meant mob rule. They're gonna overthrow us and we won't have the control. And then there was John Stuart Mill, who was like, hey, chill out, dude. The rich will still run things. Relax. They were both half right. Democracy grew, but wealth stayed where it always stays, up top. Then, a century later, a philosopher, as I mentioned earlier, named Alfred Shultz, asked the next logical question. Even if everyone gets a vote, do they even know what they're voting for? He coined the idea of the life world. It's this private bubble of experience through which you interpret everything. The problem, though, is that the modern life world has become way too damn big, and you scroll your phone, use your car, you pay your bills online, all without really understanding the infrastructure that makes any of it possible. You're surrounded by systems built by people you'll never meet, industries that you'll never study, financed by laws that you didn't know existed. And that's fine until you have to make decisions that depend on that hidden information or machinery. Shultz described 3 kinds of knowledge holders. You have your expert, that's the narrow but deep person. So for instance, the neurosurgeon, the aircraft mechanic, the coder who knows the precise syntax that keeps your data alive. Then there's the man on the street. That's the other end of the spectrum. This is the broad but shallow individual. They kind of live by recipes. If I hit the brake, the car stops. If I vote blue, things may get better. Recipe knowledge is this kind of comforting, it's edible but not nutritious type of information. Then finally, we have our happy medium, which is the well-informed citizen. This is the rarer one. They're not, so this person, the middle ground, well-informed citizen, they're not omniscient, but they question enough to recognize bias. They will cross-check sources and just kind of push beyond just mere slogans or emotions or superficial reasons for liking somebody. They don't outsource thinking, they practice it. So, to be clear, Shultz wasn't scolding people for not being experts in everything. That's literally impossible. He was warning against pretending that we are. He wanted humility, intellectual honesty, the courage to say, I don't know, but I'm going to go and try and find out. These very much parallel the same ideas and values of Samuel Adams. In fact, one thing that stands out about Samuel Adams that he was known for was, and he, by the way, he never wrote any of these things about himself. That also is what's so cool about him. All that we know about him is fragments of what his friends and people who knew him close, as well as what his adversaries have said. So that kind of makes, I don't know, it's like, it's just rare to see that in when we're looking at the different histories of prominent figures. So with Adams, he was very much aware of his limitations, and that is something that is, you don't see it in leaders really today, especially political figures. We don't see accountability in a way that feels genuine, if we even do see it. So Adams was aware of his limitations, and that was a big strength for him, right? And I think people need to remember that there is so much courage in saying simply, I don't know, I don't have that information, or that's not something that is necessarily a strength for me, but I'm going to acknowledge it, and if necessary or possible, take steps to remediate it or improve it. So anyway, that's all to say that the democracy depends on these ideas of humility, intellectual honesty, and knowing when to say, I don't know, like Socrates. So the problem is that currently in our democracy, there is sort of a weakening or atrophy that's happened from neglect, because when citizens become content, complacent consumers, politics becomes product design. When media becomes entertainment, information becomes performance. And before you know it, every election is an influencer contest. It's charisma over character, algorithm over reason, and we see this time and time again. So let's kind of shift to activism that still works, this kind of modern echo, so that we all don't just completely feel helpless and jaded all the time, because that will lead to apathy, which is very dangerous for a society, but we'll get there later. But I just want to just bring up a couple of examples. So there was the Fight for $15 movement, which was just fast food workers learned labor law, organized strikes, and forced wage increases across many states. By the way, the point of me bringing this up is not to discuss whether or not we agree or disagree with these changes. It's just to highlight that people, when they when they become informed and take steps to do something about an issue, can lead to some kind of change. Not always, and it's, can be complicated, but if you don't try, nothing's going to happen. Like, we know that, right? And then just more examples, DACA and the Dreamers. Those were the undocumented youth that really took the time to master legal code and were able to really, honestly, lobby better than most senators do. You guys can look that up. Again, whether or not you agree or disagree with these issues, it's not really the point. The point is that people band together, they put in the effort, they put in the time, and received pretty good outcomes. Then there was the net neutrality in 2015. So this, again, consisted of just your regular everyday people. They read the regulatory filings, flooded the FCC with millions of comments until broadband, the internet, was reclassified as a public utility. Because if you remember, they were essentially trying to privatize the whole internet. So these wins, again, they didn't come from experts or elites. They came from your average person, your average citizen. They came from people who refused to stay at that recipe level, man on the street degree of understanding and being informed. They learned enough to push the system, not burn it, but also not worship it. And that's what Sam Adams did in 1773, except without all the, hashtags and stuff. If Samuel Adams called for vigilance of conscience, we could say that Alfred Shultz called for more of a vigilance of understanding. They were from different centuries, but with the same underlying principle. Liberty dies when people stop paying attention. Being informed isn't about memorizing facts. It's about living deliberately inside your ignorance. It's curiosity with teeth, with a force. It's caring enough to check yourself before you're manipulated. Samuel Adams once said, "The liberties of our country and the freedom of our civil constitution are worth defending against all hazards." He didn't say worth liking on Facebook. He said defending, which implies effort, discomfort, and engagement. It requires cognitive resources. Not being a lazy thinker, not taking mental shortcuts, requires that critical thinking, that being uncomfortable when your opinions or beliefs are questioned, and instead of turning off or closing that article or book or video, or not listening to it at all because this person, I hate them, or they're dangerous, or I can't listen to someone who opposes what I view. Instead of doing that, just fucking listen to it or watch it or read it, because you have to. How can you know? You can't be informed if you only have one side of the story or issue. So always try to push yourself. Anyway, so if you really want to honor the revolution and liberty, let's just calm down on the fireworks and the whole circus show and all the overused phrases and whatnot. Be the person who asks inconvenient questions. Be the one who refuses the luxury of certainty, right? Because it's nice to just be like, I know it, I get it, and case closed. That's so easy. It's very tempting. But in a world addicted to outrage and distraction, actual thought, if you consider that, it's really the new rebellion. So just kind of a closing reflection, Samuel Adams fought to keep conscience alive in government, and Shultz tried to keep humility alive in thought. Both of those individuals were warning us about the same disease, arrogance, moral and intellectual. Remember, the well-informed citizen isn't a saint or a scholar. They're the person who stays awake while everyone else drifts into comfort or just complacency. So here is your call to arms, or better, to awareness. Don't outsource your conscience. Don't rent out your opinions. And don't treat information like background noise. Because liberty, like knowledge, dies from neglect, not assault. So next time, we will step into the algorithm itself, how the illusion of being informed kind of became the easiest form of control ever invented. I promise Samuel Adams will probably be there again, and he might show up a lot, so you should definitely read about him. There's so many good books about him. My favorite is the biography, The Revolutionary, Samuel Adams, and it's written by Stacy. I don't remember her last name, but just look it up. I think her first name is Stacy. She also wrote a biography about Cleopatra, and she has won lots of awards. So yeah, if you're interested, great biography. It reads like a novel, just really engaging, not like a boring textbook. That is everything for this episode, and I really appreciate you all tuning in. I hope you learned something. And yeah, let me know if you have questions or comments. I'm curious to see what you guys think. I will definitely be here again with a new episode next week. For now, take care of yourselves. Be safe out there. You're not alone. Just try your best to get through these crazy times. And I'll see you all next time. I'm Megan, and this is Existentially Blonde Podcast.